Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Andrew Knight, and today over the next hour or so we'll be looking at the subject of AI, artificial intelligence and ethics. Who sets the standards? And without further ado, let's meet our panel. So John, could you perhaps join us and introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Andrew. My name is John Byers, and I'm a partner in Osborne Clarke, which is an international law firm headquartered in London. I lead our international AI and machine learning team. I'm also the author of several books on AI and the law. I sit on the all-party parliamentary group for artificial intelligence, which is a joint committee of the House of Lords and House of Commons as an advisor on AI, and also participate in the Bias in AI research group, which is led by Professor Sue Black in the University of Durham, and for a former chair of the AI committee of the International Technology Law Association. Bit of a mouthful, but that's me.
Thanks, John. And Emre, would you join us as well?
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, I'm Emre Kazim. I'm co-founder and COO of Holistic AI. Holistic AI is a leading platform provider for AI risk management. We actually came out of the academy. We were researchers in the computer science department of University College London, focused on translating and operationalizing ethics into practice.
Thanks, Emre. And last but not least, Riva, could you join us as well?
Thank you. My name is Riva Schwartz. I'm a research scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and in the Information Technology Laboratory, where I am part of the Trustworthy and Responsible AI team. They're working on our NIST AI risk management framework and leading the work on AI bias. Just since it's an international endeavor, I'm just going to point out that NIST is a federal agency in the US government under the Department of Commerce.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Riva. So thanks all for joining. We have over 130 registrations from 36 countries, so as ever, a tremendous representation in terms of people listening to this afternoon. Please do submit questions to our panel, as it really does help to bring the conversation to life. If you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions any time using the question box on your screen. We'll pick up as many as we can as we go through the session, and also at the end, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity for another piece of Q&A as well. So without further ado, let's get into the meat and drink of the session. Perhaps, and if I could start with you, Emre, and it's perhaps quite a fundamental question to ask here, which is why choose AI, artificial intelligence, over human decision making?
So in a way, I guess the kind of question of automation we're seeing is increasingly becoming of importance, not just in business, but also in society writ large. So there's kind of two reasons, two kind of ways we can approach it. From the business perspective, it's almost as though there's just massive cost benefits, it's more efficient, you can do things at scale, etc. But also it's, if you don't automate in a way, you don't remain competitive. So companies are really facing the pressure to be able to remain competitive, and they're doing this via automation. And from a kind of societal perspective, AI is, in one sense, there's almost a kind of inevitability in terms of the amount of automation that's going to be taking place in general in a society, but it also represents very important opportunities. So AI has the opportunity to for accessibility, for things like it's potentially more fair, and we can talk about that in much more detail in this webinar. So there's like massive opportunities associated with the use of AI, massive benefits, and as we're probably going to discuss in more detail as a group, there's also risks associated with that. One of the kind of business logic side of it is, and this is something that we're seeing all the time, is that if companies don't automate, they're at existential risk. And if companies do automate, they're also an existential risk. It brings with it a whole bunch of risks, but it's something that's necessary. That's why AI risk management and mediating that risk concern is of central importance.
I mean, Emre, you've talked there about speed as being one of the real benefits, but I guess it's also interesting to sort of talk about what actually can AI do better than humans, because there's obviously just that speed and efficiency, but are there areas where actually we just see more effective decision making than a human is capable of?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, and this is I'll pick a kind of nice, meaty example is if you look at an example of marketing. clearly AI is better than, let's say, human decision makers or human campaigns at targeting individuals and product placement and so on and so forth. So there's actually lots and lots of examples where AI is much more efficacious than, let's say, a kind of human constructed campaign. Of course, actually, there's plenty of examples there. So we can see when we do kind of statistically significant national-wide, let's say, campaigns in terms of public medicine and so on and so forth, we see huge benefits of using AI. We saw this in the COVID pandemic, the use of AI in terms of behavioral analytics and so on and so forth. So there's actually lots and lots of areas where AI can do a much better job than, let's say, human decision makers. It really is a question about making sure that it is doing a better job and ensuring that it's being used in a way that's trustworthy and responsible. But actually, it's not just, as you said, just about cost. There's just things like supply chain management, placement of products, even just generally in terms of managing operational use of algorithms is just lots and lots of use cases where it's significantly better than the human decision-making process.
And are you seeing particular sectors? You obviously mentioned a few there, but are you seeing some particular sectors where adoption is very far ahead in comparison? And also, do you have any knowledge particularly of where the built environment's using it?
So what we found is that there was a few years ago when we were in the academy, we were describing AI in a very technical term, and we were describing it in terms of the models, etc. But with the legislative interventions, let's say, for example, the EU AI Act, the way that was proposed, I'm not sure if it's going to pass the US Algorithm Accountability Act, we're seeing a much more general description of automation. And if we understand it in terms of automation or automation of processes, decision assisting systems, and so on and so forth, it's effectively ubiquitous. We might not be seeing the adoption of neural networks in spam detection, but we're certainly finding automation across industry. What's been interesting when we're actually going out and engaging is actually informing people that AI isn't this, it's just more used in a more lay vernacular. It isn't this esoteric thing. It isn't questions about general intelligence and so on and so forth. It very much is actually about automation. And we're seeing this across industry. The ones which are surfacing in terms of public concern, the areas that we've seen is retail banking. So you can see lots of cases in terms of credit scoring and so on and so forth. We're seeing lots of interest in insurance, and we're seeing this lots of interest in HR tech. Marketing has been used for a long time. In a way, it was a massive driver of AI development. But within those contexts, you can imagine, for example, in the built environment, building insurance, management of infrastructure, pedestrian traffic, and so on and so forth, transport systems within cities, smart cities. We saw this huge, let's say, flourishing of IoT. And then as a consequence of maybe not doing it properly, we haven't been able to get the analytics on top of it, but still it's a very much prescient and on the cusp of being exploited in a much more large-scale way. So actually we're seeing it, if we think about it, automation as a less esoteric term, we're seeing this, ubiquitously adopted across industries.
Indeed, thanks, Emery. Now, to a large extent, the heart of our conversation this afternoon can almost be encapsulated by the concept of bias. And Riva, I'd like to ask you to help our audience understand, why does bias occur in AI in the first place? What's the root problem that we're dealing with in terms of trying to make sure bias doesn't creep in?
Right, yeah, and I think before I describe that, I would just say that bias isn't always bad. Sometimes, like in marketing, as Emery just said, that bias is a good thing because it helps customers sort through the fire hose of information, but when it leads to harmful or negative impacts, this is really where we're all talking about. So I think our work at NIST, we released a document where we identified 3 major sources of bias: systemic, computational statistical, and human bias. So systemic bias, often referred to as historical or institutional bias, this is kind of the result, comes from institutional practices that in turn come from societal norms that cause some groups to be favored or advantaged and other groups to be disadvantaged or disfavored. So this is where we get at these concepts of fairness and discrimination. And in the United States, we have something called disparate impact, which is a test to determine discrimination. But So this type of bias, of course, is not necessarily the result of conscious prejudice or purposeful discrimination, but just kind of existing societal rules. So an example here would be, an example of a systemic bias is that, men are more likely to be breadwinners and women are more likely to be caregivers. So moving down to the second type, computational and statistical bias, this is a bias that gets the most attention in AI because it's easier to measure. It's really about sampling factors. We always have bias, even outside of AI. We always have bias when we have issues with sampling. But we always hear the problem that, the problem is in the data, the data used in the system, again, just a sample. So, so taking the systemic bias I started with, where men are always breadwinners, women are always caregivers. That idea can be captured in word embeddings, for example, which is a process used in machine learning to represent words within the models used within AI systems. And then we get scenarios where in online search, photos are more likely to be shown as nurses and men are more likely to be doctors. So now we move to the third type, which is human bias, human cognitive bias. Of course, this is usually implicit or unconscious, relates to how humans take in information and make decisions. So back to our men are breadwinners, women are caregivers. An AI system that learns that physicians are more likely to be men, an automated hiring official, a hiring official using an automated hiring application, searching for physicians, the recommendation is going to be inaccurately skewed away from women applicants. But it's important to know that, specifically within human cognitive bias, this doesn't just happen at the very end of the system with the person who's making decisions based on the output. There's humans along the entire AI lifecycle, and of course, so from problem formulation, the idea that an AI is what's needed, data set selection or curation, validation choices, and optimization. These are all functions performed by humans. So, yep.
I suppose that's a very important point you make there, that this sense that the life cycle of developing and running AI means that we need to be thinking about these issues all the way through. It's not just a sort of a one particular point in the process. I mean, what are the areas where you've already seen social groups most affected by bias? I mean, I suppose there's some obvious ones you've alluded to in terms of recruitment, but where have we seen problems already that have really highlighted the risks here?
Right, so certainly hiring, but lending in the criminal justice community domain, anywhere where there's potential for disparate impact. But the other problem here is that we can't really estimate how extensive the problem is. The use of proxies is a good example of how, so any application that uses proxies in and of themselves are not problematic, but without being validated, we don't know whether it's actually measuring the thing it's measuring. So we have a lot of examples. I think I'll describe those more later, but when we talk about things like criminality or lendability, we're in a state where people who are historically excluded or not involved or not captured in the data are not going to be are potentially going to be discriminated against or have harms.
And I suppose once again, going back to your point about the kind of human impact here, I guess there's always a danger here that we imagine that bias is only a feature of AI, because clearly human bias is almost a larger problem. I've heard the human brain described as the most opaque black box ever compared to even neural networks. So we forget that human beings are really almost part of the problem here in terms of them bringing their biases into design and operation. But do you think there is the potential that actually AI models will be better at getting rid of bias eventually than actually human beings, that there's this opportunity here?
I think there's certainly an opportunity to maximize the benefits of AI. We have these risks, not just bias, but now that we're talking about bias, we have these risks that are kind of holding back the positive impacts of AI. And yes, that is true. I think humans are kind of the ultimate opaque system. speed and scale, the problem is that systems that are biased and the speed and scale at which they can perpetuate that bias is much worse. The impact is much farther and faster than than human bias. So.
Indeed, thanks. Now, before I bring Riva and John back onto the next question, I saw you nodding a lot, Emery. Did you have some particular thoughts about that subject?
Well, it's just we were looking at, we get this question all the time. So just as the background, I actually entered the computer science department after doing my doctorate in philosophy. And there was all these conversations amongst the engineers about, okay, what do we do about this thing that people are talking about? You talk about subconscious biases or biases in processes or decision making at different parts of the AI lifecycle. And actually what we found was there was real concern. And then I was saying part of the problem of solving the problem of bias is that humanity has done a terrible job at it. We have horrible precedents. And then we penned an article with a judge. And there was a kind of back and forth, which was, there's a kind of elephant in the room here. If the system is replicating the historical performance, if you will, then arguing that, oh God, these algorithmic systems are biased isn't particularly solving that problem. So it was just actually to motivate this problem of saying, what do we mean by that? I think the massive opportunity is not necessarily in creating a utopia vis-a-vis algorithmic adoption, but actually algorithms are processes. We're able to analyze them, and we can very much surface performance. We can surface assumptions, and then once we do that, then we're able to say, hang on a minute, it looks strange that we're sentencing this demographic disproportionately against another demographic. It looks strange that that all the candidates that are being pushed forward are male and a tiny proportion are female. At the very least, when we have when we're able to assess these systems, we're bringing a lot of things to the surface, which in, let's call it, the kind of non-automated automated was happening anyway. So I certainly take the point that Riva is saying, that we need to be very cognizant of the reach and scale with which automated systems can, if they are biased, actually perpetuate that. And that's something which we need to be super cognizant of and ensure that before we, if you will, release the system into the world, we have a certain level of confidence. But it's a lot more, but certainly picking up on that, I couldn't agree more with Riva's kind of general conceptualization of it.
Thanks,
Andrew, if I could add just something,
please.
Yeah, I mean, I take the legalistic view, as you'd expect me to take as a lawyer. I'm not a data scientist, although I've experienced AI in many forms. And I think actually for me the most interesting and revealing thing is essentially what Emery has just said, which is that the unassailable combination is not AI in isolation. Or not human decisions in isolation, is a combination of AI and humans. And I think there was a study which looked at high-performing, it might have been chess or Go, and it compared the performance of purely human players with purely AI players and players that were a combination of humans and AI. And in every case, it was the combination of humans and AI that actually was unassailable. And we'll get onto this later on in the conversation, but I think that's something that's going to be reflected in downstream regulation when it comes to artificial intelligence, which is the whole concept of having a human in the loop. And I do completely accept that there are some AI processes which, due to their scale and speed, are going to be difficult to interject humans in the loop. But having that common sense kill switch or sense check or appeal process moderated by a human, I think is going to be absolutely essential going forward.
I would add, just on the human in the loop point, I would just add, yes, as long as we have proper governance for that, because what we found in research is that the humans in the loop can provide either insight or oversight, but they can't do both. And sometimes, people just think we'll just throw a human on it, and they'll something bad happens, and they know that they're there for oversight. So this is where strong governance comes into play.
I think you're absolutely. Sorry, Andrew. I was just going to say you're absolutely right, Riva. I mean, the one thing that I find quite amusing is that humans themselves can exhibit automation bias if they
Yeah.
blindly trust the output of a computer. It's the kind of computer says no syndrome.
Exactly.
And actually, this is hard coded into the GDPR, which is that the involvement, the human involvement, needs to be meaningful.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Indeed. No, I was just about to say that there's always that risk that we put a system together which gets rid of bias, and then we introduce a human at the end who puts the bias back in. So the governance point is really important. Now, maybe come back to you, Riva. It's a question I'll perhaps pose to you and John, but starting with you, Riva. What are some notable cases of bias that you've seen in AI, just to sort of scare the horses, as it were? What can happen when this goes badly wrong?
Yeah, so I want to use like proxies as kind of the core to wrap some of the. It's certainly not every case of something bad that's happened. I mean, I know you're all very familiar with the A-level scandal,
Yeah.
But I think proxies help us understand how the challenges with data and models can be exacerbated by AI system limitations, and how when human assumptions don't take those limitations into consideration. So, so proxies are used. Just a tiny few sentences about that. In the absence of ground truth, when we don't know what the answer is, or when we don't have data that directly measures a specific concept, designers often create proxies. But those proxies are really a common source of bias. And so, an example from the healthcare domain in the US, a study from Science, it showed that 10 widely used algorithms for the distribution of care within the US favored white patients over Black patients, because the algorithm used healthcare costs as a proxy for health needs. That they kind of assumed that patients who spent more on healthcare were sicker and needed more help. But in the United States, higher spenders are actually more wealthy and more likely to be white. So they had the reverse outcome, and the algorithm allocated less care to Black patients who had the same medical conditions as white patients. But then, sometimes proxies are created for concepts that are not observable or capturable. There's a recent article in Wired about algorithmic decision system called NarxCare. This system's model is based on a proxy for narcotic use referred to as addictiveness. So here we are again with these unobservable constructs. And it wasn't validated ahead of time. And so, so in deployment and over time, the model made incorrect decisions, resulting in people being denied medication that they genuinely needed. And it resulted, so where does bias come in? It resulted in disparate impact because on gender, because women are more likely to experience chronic pain and more likely to be wrongly identified as highly addictive. And then I think one of my favorite examples is what happens when you don't have the right people at the table. When the COVID vaccine first came out at Stanford University, they put together an algorithm to identify the order in which the staff at the university, at the hospital, would receive the vaccine.
Wow.
The problem was that all the administrators in the top echelon of the organization got all the top slots. There's systemic bias again. So none of those people were people who had direct, face-to-face with who were patients or at risk. So only 7 out of the 1,300 frontline workers were prioritized for the first 5,000 doses. So, nobody checked that the proxies led to sensible outcomes. So again, it's this combination of human and automation, and just, it's new. People don't know how to handle these systems, and we kind of hand over, we assume. There's also this kind of, you talked about, kind of over trusting systems. There's something called the McNamara fallacy, or techno-chauvinism is also referred to as that, numerical data or technology is just better. It's right, it works well. It works, and it works well in all conditions, when of course that's not the case. And so people don't, put these kinds of, constraints on systems that they might do for non-technical remedies.
Thanks, Riva. And John, moving to you, what examples can you bring to the table?
Well, I love the term techno-chauvinism, and it's a great segue into my first case, which I'm sure most of my fellow panel will have heard of, and that was the very unfortunate recruitment tool that Amazon introduced probably about 4 or 5 years ago, which was designed to be an automated resume selection tool. And this again is possibly something that we ought to pick up in the discussion. But what comes out in these examples is a distinct lack of common sense. And I think these things fail the sniff test, and you wonder quite how these huge organizations that have relatively unlimited resources manage to get themselves into these positions. But this CV or resume selection tool decided, created a false correlation, which was it didn't like the term women or women's in resumes. So if a woman had put women's captain, it deselected those resumes. And if a woman had gone to all female colleges, then it also deprioritized those candidates. And Amazon realized that this was actually not a good way to progress, and quietly pulled the plug on that tool. There weren't any legal consequences coming out of that, but it was an interesting case. Other ones that have crept out include Facebook's filtering naming system, which sense checks account names to make sure that they're real names and not fake accounts. And there was a widely publicized case a few years back of a Native American called Shane Creeping Bear. He tried to register a name on Facebook and was rejected and told that he was a fake account, and created outrage. Google has also got itself into hot water with its image algorithm, and specifically tagging images of African Americans as gorillas, which was outrageous and obviously caused a huge outcry at the time. I think Google itself was horrified. But these are really egregious cases, and there was a case in the UK in relation to a gym provider that refused to allow a doctor access to the female changing rooms because the entry system had correlated the term doctor with males. So she could get into the male change rooms, but not the female change rooms, which is just extraordinary. And I think on a slightly more serious note, the one case that I think which is quite worrying is Wisconsin and Loomis, which was a case of an automated pre-sentencing system that basically provided a statistical output on the likelihood of recidivism in relation to offenders. And this chap Loomis had been, I think, involved in a drive-by shooting, and he was African American. He challenged the system, which indicated that there was a high degree of him repeating an offence. I think he was a first-time offender, and I think there was some anecdotal evidence to show that the system was biased against African Americans, and he challenged his due process in the state of Wisconsin. And this system is widespread in use in the United States, and actually has been trialled in the United Kingdom. But what the court actually said was that they would apply a health warning to these reports. So it ruled that his due process hadn't been violated, but that in effect judges should take the output of the system with a pinch of salt. And what I find really worrying about that is that, again, we're faced with the prospect of a judge potentially falling into the trap of automation bias and assuming that because the system has produced this detailed statistic report on his likelihood of repeat offending, that they'll just accept it at face value. So I'm not convinced that that's a particularly satisfactory outcome, but that is the law of Wisconsin now. So those are essentially the cases that I would retell, Andrew.
Thanks, John. Now the next question, I think, unfortunately, it's guaranteed to head for you first, which is, given your profession, which is, who's responsible when AI makes biased decisions? Where does the buck stop?
Right. Well, where do I start with this? I'm going to unpack it, and as I'm a kind of UK former EU lawyer, I'm going to focus on a few filters, and I think the first one inevitably is the GDPR, and I think the UK and the EU both have versions of the GDPR now post Brexit, and where we start is with the processing of personal data. So, and that's really where people get worried when AI makes biased decisions. I think the key principle to cover first in the GDPR is this concept of fairness, which is set out in Article 5.1, which basically says that people have the right to have their data processed fairly and with consequences that they could reasonably expect, and not with prejudiced outcomes. And obviously, potentially, a biased AI system could breach this overall fairness principle in the GDPR. Overlaying that, there are two specific articles which are relevant, I think, to AI systems. And the first is Article 22, which refers to automated decision making. And what that says is that data subjects, i.e. people who are being processed by AI systems, must directly consent where an automated decision is being conducted on their behalf. That's a decision without meaningful human involvement in the way that we've described it earlier on in the discussion, or they're being profiled, so they're being assessed in terms of their own personal characteristics for whether it's marketing or some other targeted service. So direct consent needs to apply there. And also Article 9, which talks about special category data, which is essentially the protected characteristics of an individual. So where it's biometric information relating to an individual that is being used for identification or health, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, these classes of special category data also need to have the data subject's direct consent. So in GDPR cases, the responsible party is going to be, by and large, the data owner, which is the data controller. It's the party that owns the data. There may be a third party who is processing the data controller's data, who could be liable, but that's only if, and I'm paraphrasing here given the time constraints we've got, but that would be in situations where the processor has not followed the controller's instructions.
But sorry, carry on, John.
No. So that's the GDPR position, and then within the UK we also have something called the Equality Act, which also is designed to prevent. It was predominantly designed to prevent discrimination, harassment, victimization in the workplace, but also applies to what's called service provision. Section 29 of the Equality Act applies to service provision, and the classic example of that is the situation where some of you may have heard of this. Certainly in the UK, it was a big case where a baker refused to bake a gay cake for a same-sex couple. So that was a classic Section 29 case under the Equality Act, a service provision case, and the same situation applies in relation to artificial intelligence. The Equality Act does not make any distinction in relation to machine decisions. It's entirely technology neutral. So in that situation, it's the service provider that will be liable, and it doesn't really care. The Act doesn't really care one jot whether or not it's an automated decision that has caused the discrimination, or it's a direct human decision that has caused the discrimination. You, as a service provider, you will be fixed with that liability, and the person who has been damaged by that discrimination can claim damages, principally for injury to feelings. So you've got service providers under the Equality Act, you've got data controllers under the GDPR. And now the third filter is the forthcoming Artificial Intelligence Act, which doesn't overtly, well, it does cover some bias issues. Its focus is predominantly in relation to data governance when it comes to bias, data governance and the data sets, and ensuring that as a provider, your data set is and this strikes terror into the fear of AI providers, because it's very binary in its standards, and I'm sure Emre and Riva are aware of this. It talks about 100% accuracy and zero bias, which really does strike terror into the fear, which is impossible to achieve.
Yeah.
It's something that needs to be referred to in terms of mitigation. But basically, when the AI comes into effect, if the AI provider puts in place a biased decision, then there's the potential for them to be liable. So those are the classes of potential victims under the legislation.
I suppose what really comes to mind, John, particularly, is once you move off the statute book for a particular jurisdiction, is how in the real world individuals establish that they've been on the receiving end of a biased decision, and how that in the adversarial model, how do you defend against that? But how does an individual even really establish a case that they've actually been, that indeed automation has even taken place, and that they have been, affected in this negative way? It feels in the real world a very long way away from the clean definition of the statute book.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for an individual to establish that discrimination or bias is that they've been the victim of that kind of decision, and it would need to be massively publicised actually before they realise that they were disadvantaged. And actually, when it comes to things like the Equality Act in the UK, the kinds of injury to feelings damages that an individual can get are not huge. I mean, the damages scale for that act are designed for sustained campaigns of harassment and discrimination, which take place over long periods of time in the workplace. They don't really apply to the one-off potential cases that apply in the context of service provisions. So at the moment, the lower band for injury to feelings damages under the Equality Act is around starts at around £1,000. So pretty de minimis.
Indeed. Moving on to Emery, if I might now, it sounds like an easy thing to say, but how can you eliminate data and coding bias in AI? Do you have a magic wand there, Emery?
No, I think probably everyone will share this view that it's about managing the risk, about putting in the appropriate processes whereby you can say, look, we've taken this problem seriously. We can evidence that we've taken this problem seriously. We've got documentation, processes in place, training has been conducted, and we have a way to do this at scale. So really, the way we think about it is kind of just crudely speaking, let's talk about it kind of managing the governance risks. That's all the risks that I was just mentioning, things like taxonomy of responsibility, reporting lines, documentation, and so on and so forth. And then there's a kind of second bracket, which is, let's say, managing the technical risks. So actually being able to assess algorithmic performance across different verticals, from privacy to explainability to robustness and bias, and actually use those kind of technical assessments to inform or to direct some of the documentation and decision making that's taking place, putting the good governance into practice. I think the way we're kind of reading the ecosystem, my reading of it, if you will, is that probably the last decade was defined by data and data governance, data legislation, and so on, and this decade is going to be defined by AI. And I think that the first half of this decade will probably be in put your good processes in place, let's get governance structures, systematize this, documentation, and so on. And probably towards the second half of the decade, we'll get probably codification of technical standards. We're following very closely, Riva, what's taking place in NIST. We've seen some awesome stuff come out, and it's great to actually see the US leading on this in terms of the technical standardization. But really, that's kind of generally about how do we move towards a generally recognized or reasonable approach to risk management of these systems. We're not going to solve the let's say general problems of bias. We're not going to solve that, but what we are going to do is actually put into processes, put into place things which we can say we've reasonably assessed these problems, and these are the kind of decisions that we've made or haven't made. What we don't want is, if you will, a wild west of algorithmic use.
And one point I'd like to probe, Emery, is, and I know we've chatted about this in previous conversations, is this sort of concept of explainability, because obviously depending on the kind of technology people are using, there is a challenge around just even understanding how a decision has been raised. I mean, a number of the things that we've talked about, it sounds like we've been able to kind of almost go back through the model and understand the keywords, the proxies that have caused the problems. But I guess there is a concern that some approaches will be that true black box where it'll be very hard, apart from just looking at inputs and outputs, to understand where the problem is.
So really, so let's say there's two dimensions when we're discussing explainability. I think the first thing is there's let's say the AI explainability, the explainability in terms of the actual system itself. And then there is explaining to a human being, to a mere mortal such as myself, what on earth is going on. And actually, this allays into some of the points John was making about consent. So if we have an explanation, and then we have a demand that this explanation should be in a way translated into a vernacular that's digestible or understandable to a non-engineer or citizen, are we going to is that a meaningful translation? Does that track the truth? How is anyone actually going to meaningfully be able to assess that? So there's that problem, which goes right into the kind of consumer side. But from the explainability in terms of the model itself, I think there's two sides also to that. The first side is it depends on the problem that or it depends on the context in which you're using it. If you're DeepMind and you're saying we want to use a super complex model to postulate or to suggest certain protein folding examples that we can go and test in the lab and so on, then who cares if it's not explainable? There's just like layers and layers of distance between the result of that system and it being used for patients. If you're using a system that's not explainable to decide credit score or to decide insurance premiums and so on, then you have a problem. So what we have is actually to think about so it's a gradation. Some systems are fully explainable and some systems are just indiscernible. And it depends on whether or not we have an explainability demand that we can actually dictate whether or not we should or shouldn't use that kind of system. So if we're going to make those kind of decisions in criminal justice and so on and so forth, it probably is simply unacceptable to use systems that cannot be explained adequately. If we're using systems that don't have that kind, if we're using, for example, an algorithm in a trading algorithms come from the financial computing group, then it doesn't have that kind of concern. The second thing is how invasive or how much detail do we need from the provider of that system. So we've been looking at this with actually the UK ICO at levels of auditability. So it's about proportionality, respect for IP, and so it depends. So the explanations can come in different forms. And I guess if we're in particular contexts where it's critical and important to have a very detailed explanation, a very transparent one, then we probably dictate that we need to have a certain level of access and that system should probably be of a particular class. In other contexts, it may not be warranted. So so really this problem of explainability is just, it used to be that this was the big conversation that we were having. But now what we're finding is that explainability in what context, explanation of what? Explanation of bias, explanation of efficacy, and then there's also the trade-off, which probably is another can of worms, as if you're making very stringent demands that a system should be private, it may come at the cost of explainability. And is that a trade-off that we're comfortable making? So we haven't really solved this problem.
Yeah, and I would kind of agree with you. I mean, I think the worrying thing that I see with the regulation, certainly the AIA that's coming down the pipe, is it's worryingly inconsistent in terms of its definition and contradictory actually in terms of its view on explainability and transparency. These are concepts that are not used in a consistent fashion.
Thanks, John. Before we move on to the next question, Riva, could I quickly get your perspective on the previous question about responsibility from a US perspective? Because obviously John gave us a very good kind of UK, Europe GDPR perspective. But what does the landscape look like in the US around that issue of responsibility and legislative framework?
Yeah, so I can speak just more to within an organization whose responsibility is it to make sure this gets to the issue of accountability, which is what we call one of the trustworthy characteristics. And that on one hand we say, well, it's everybody's job within an organization, but of course it starts with management and setting policies in place. But it can't be everybody's job in that it becomes nobody's job. So somebody has to be accountable at the organizational level. But within the legal framework of in the U.S. who's responsible. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to delve into it.
No.
That I think some of the other issues too that John kind of alluded to is how do people know when they were the victim? They may not have even known that they were impacted in any way. They just, something happened, they didn't get a job, they have no idea that they didn't get the job because of some kind of bias. And also, people can be impacted by AI-based decision making, even if they don't use AI, the AI, right? So we have like price gouging for certain neighborhoods that apps or ride-hailing services go to, and even if you don't use the app, those price gouging rates are charged to you anyway. So, and what's the redress for that?
Indeed,
yeah.
indeed.
I mean, I can give you a very I'll sign a disclaimer, but I'll give you a very brief kind of snapshot from my perspective about what's interesting, what's happening in the States, and I think a couple of snapshots for our American or attendees. Firstly, I think there's a wave of data-related legislation at state law, which is beginning to come stream in the United States, and California, with the newly enhanced CPRA, is leading the way. But we're also seeing GDPR-like laws that are coming into force, I think, in Virginia and New Hampshire in January 2023. The other thing that I think is really interesting is non-data related, but is to do with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission's inherent jurisdiction under Section 5 to deal with deceptive trade practices. And again, this is something that will strike terror into the heart of AI companies. But there was a recent case called Everalbum, which was settled, which was brought by the FTC under its Section 5 jurisdiction. I see Riva's nodding, but she's aware of that. But this is a case that has gone way beyond the European Union, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And what happened there was a company called Everalbum, which was deceiving the consumers. It was an app, which was a photo storage app, and it was taking biometric facial images without consent, and it was also lying to consumers to say that it would delete those images if they complained about them. And the FTC basically said to them, you delete the offending data, but not only that, you delete or unwind the algorithm that has been trained on that offending data, which I think is an incredibly fascinating point. Because how do you unlearn an algorithm? Yeah.
I think referred to as algorithmic disgorgement. Yes.
Oh, exactly. I need to write that down.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating. And yeah, so
and they went bust. Everalbum went bust as a result of that, unsurprisingly. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate John stepping in and bringing the legal. I will just say that it is important to note that in the U.S., lending, education, hiring, these are the regulated industries. But right now, there is no national level regulation on AI-based risk bias, but the FTC is the organization that steps in on this right now.
And they've been incredibly purposive in their approach. They've really aggressively taken that space, which I think is very interesting.
Indeed, thanks. Well, we'll probably stay with you, John, actually, because the next question almost leads very directly from that, is around the issue of privacy. What are these privacy issues? You just talked there about people's photographs being harvested, but what are those areas? And obviously, when you talk about GDPR, it starts off with that kind of personal data, but it's a natural link to think about the whole privacy dimension of models and the data that they use.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I guess the question was framed in the context of privacy issues around the use of AI, and inevitably that is going to kind of migrate towards the use of sensitive personal data and the kinds of data that have hit the headlines to date are the kind of ever album situation. It's the facial data, and facial recognition creates a lot of emotion, particularly when it's used by law enforcement. And I think that's where we've seen a number of major issues. And it won't surprise you, Andrew, for me to tell you that a lot of this litigation, certainly in Europe, has been around testing the limits of the GDPR in relation to the acquisition of that data. And there was a very high-profile case quite recently in the UK, which was the first overt facial recognition case, which was Bridges against the South Wales Police. And this was the South Wales Police that were essentially stationing mobile AFR, automated facial recognition vans, outside Cardiff Stadium. And just indiscriminately, they did have warnings around their vans, but just indiscriminately firing these cameras at people to see whether or not they brought up what they call persons of interest. So these would be people in the National Police Database that are, people that the police would suspect of a crime or would like to question. And of course, in the course of capturing these images, and they did delete the faces that were not matched, but in the course of deleting, they are processing. They're actually trying to match the faces, and that was the essence of the litigation. And they were challenged on the basis that they didn't obtain the consent of these people to actually get their or validly get the consent of these people to use or to process their facial data. And what the court held was, no, they could, because they were conducting law enforcement. There wasn't any kind of breach on that ground, but they were actually in breach of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to a private life. So they did actually breach that, and they were in breach of something that UK public authorities have to conform to, which is the public sector equality duty, which is essentially making certain that the algorithmic systems that they're using did not discriminate against people who were in ethnic minorities. So they didn't conduct, and we're going right the way back to Emre's impact assessment and evaluation. They didn't conduct a deep enough impact assessment or evaluation on the use case, so they were found to have violated that as well. So that's this facial recognition, which is the flashpoint. That was the main case. There was another case in Sweden where a school was basically decided to use facial recognition to streamline registration for the kids, and the Swedish Data Protection Authority, data inspection as they're called, basically said, no, you can't do that, and fined them 200,000 krona. Again, they hadn't really conducted a proper impact assessment, and the use, and this is something else that is an ethical question in relation to the use of AI. The use of AI was disproportionate for the particular use case. So I think there's an element of proportionality involved, which is tied to common sense. You've got to be very careful that you don't use this technology when something which is not as invasive would produce an equally valid result. And I think that was the output of that particular case. So.
Thanks, John. Well, coming to you, Riva, and it's been fascinating as we discussed, and how much the role of the human beings have in terms of governance and responsibility here. So when we come to the question of how can we build trustworthy AI, at the risk of priming you, it feels like human beings have a lot to role to play here in terms of common sense has been a word that's been used a lot. But what are your thoughts on how do we build AI that people can trust?
Well, yes, and as Emery so kindly pointed out, we at NIST are developing an AI risk management framework that is kind of the bulk of our work on trustworthy and responsible AI. I should point out that NIST is a non-regulatory agency, so it is a voluntary framework and standard, non-regulatory, not anti-regulatory, just non-regulatory. It's important to point out that that it is voluntary, and the purpose of the framework is to equip organizations. So it really takes an enterprise level, enterprise look, but not just on enterprise risks. These risks are societal in nature, but the purpose of the framework and associated documents, we have a playbook, for example, a how-to manual, a bunch of supporting documents, including the document on bias that I mentioned earlier. So how do we equip organizations to address and manage the risk? We can't get rid of we can't get rid of all of these risks, unfortunately. So what are the characteristics of trustworthiness and what makes the system trustworthy? So we identified, we collapsed a very long list down into 7 things, which is fairness, accountability, transparency, explainability, and interpretability, which are together. That has to be safe, secure, and resilient. Bias, fairness and bias go together, and also safe. You know, it's kind of the first thing, do no harm. But whether a system is trustworthy and whether a person trusts it are 2 different things. But we are exclusively really focused on making systems trustworthy. So we're trying to enhance organizational culture and practices where they're really focusing and thinking about risk across the enterprise, and then getting better at measuring, assessing what the risks are, measuring it, and then managing it. So noting, just a quick plug, that the process for our framework is ongoing. We just released our, well, it seems like we just did it, but it was back in August, our most recent draft. The public comment period is open until September 29th. So I know people think worldwide that they don't have much to say, but we listen to people from wherever they come from. But specific to bias, I'd say, there's a number of approaches that we can do to enhance trustworthiness. So first of all, like Emery talked about, getting better at anticipating risks and limitations of technology, and thinking about context means you have to get better at, you have to broaden your horizons. So internally, this means your organization has to be more very multidisciplinary, not just demographically, but also what your domain expertise is, lived experiences, hiring people who know how to translate context and impact findings between, across the stakeholder community. Relying on domain experts where they, domain expertise matters, bring them in. Externally, we're trying to build approaches that can help organizations set up capacity for gaining local knowledge about the specific use case they're building towards. And so, this goes by different names like participatory or multi-stakeholder engagement. And so how, that's kind of new to the AI community, and it has to be something that the AI community can implement. We can't have some long process that it's not going to be adopted. Whether it works well, if it's long and onerous, it's not going to be adopted. Of course, getting better at recognizing, exploring, and keyword here, documenting the limitations of AI, and then scientific integrity at the heart of all of this, testing and evaluation, validating, testing, not using your deployed product to test with. We talked a lot about proxies today and how problematic they can be. There are constructs at the heart of those proxies that should be validated to ensure that what you're seeking to measure with your AI system is actually measurable. And then the heart of it all, we talked about the humans here. So all of those things are done by humans, but without strong organizational buy-in and strong governance practices and structures, we can't really make an impact here. So the purpose of those is to kind of change the culture at this level, because if there's not an organizational buy-in, the frontline practitioners might be wanting to do the right thing and trying to do that, but if the organization isn't bought in, it's not gonna expand beyond that small group.
Indeed. Thanks, Riva. Well, conscious of time, and Emery, for the last question, I'm going to ask you to predict the future for us and answer the question: what does the future hold for AI in the built environment and other sectors? Well, what's your sort of couple of minutes worth of predictions for AI?
Yeah, if I may, just to add to the last 2 comments, just very briefly, because there's only 1 minute. I think it's an imperative that we think about this practically. So we've been seeing a huge amount of literature, publications, debate about this from 2018. And one of the big problems that we found is that there is a lot of these kind of policy papers, legal discussions, and so on. And actually, as soon as you touch industry, as soon as you start to do this in practice, very quickly you start to see a massive difference between operationalizing it, the practical aspects of it, and actually these debates that we've been having more in the literature. And there's just so many examples of that. One to pick up is the issue of privacy. This idea that we need to be concerned about privacy and then realizing that when you're asking a company to evidence that their system isn't biased, that they're supposed to, in that context, they will be processing personal sensitive data. So it's a choice. It's a substantive choice. It's a question that we should ask ourselves, but it's a question that's raised as a practical result of looking at the system in practice. I'm really excited to see use cases come out of governance. You talk, for example, rather talk about participatory mechanisms. I'm really keen. There's lots of NGOs talking about this, and every time I engage with them, I'm saying, let's try this out. Let's get going. Let's actually start to look at this thing in practice. Because what I really worry about is a GDPR 2.0. You know, we get a kind of solution of a pop-up on a website that says you're interacting with an AI. Do you consent or not? And then people just clicking. We're going to get this kind of formulaic response. And I'm keen that we get meaningful consent, we get meaningful assurance, meaningful explainability. And I think this is really going to be coming from a kind of empirical, or let's try this, let's get going with this thing. So really the kind of practical imperative is really at the heart of my current concerns.
And I guess in terms of that future, I think there's a positive note there isn't it? That actually the more we put these into practice, into context, get that multi-stakeholder participation you talked about, Riva, that actually we will get better outcomes because we move beyond the theoretical and we learn by doing, and hopefully we're in a reasonably safe environment with everybody with their eyes open in terms of the context and the way these things are governed. So I think there's an optimistic note there, I think, at the end of our discussion.
I would just add, yeah, so it's not data-centric or model-centric or human-centric. It depends on the scenario and getting and thinking about what does this context require. Yeah, and it's bigger, you know, it's all of those things, and it's also technology. We also have to have computational answers too.
Yeah, absolutely. Any last word from you, John, before we close?
No, well, I mean, my only observation is, you know, I mean, I would throw in a couple of market trends, which I think the audience might be interested in. I think AI is becoming, as a technology, is becoming disaggregated. I think we're seeing it move away from large data centers into the edge. There's a huge drive to get compute into smaller devices, which will mean that AI becomes ever more ubiquitous. I think one of my fellow panelists used that term. And it certainly, as the built environment's concerned, I think the big challenge, and I'm hoping this will be cracked in the next 5 years or so, will be to get standards interoperability going. One of the things that holds the built environment back is this multiplicity of different standards that applies across the built environment landscape. And I know there are huge drives to get that interoperability going, and the EU is very focused on that in relation to non-personal data as well, with the Data Act and the Data Governance Act. So we might have a big bang in terms of standards in this sector, if that does happen.
Well, John, Emre, Riva, it's been great to talk. Really appreciate your contribution this afternoon. But for today, thanks ever so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a reminder that we'll publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar, as well as the presentation online. And please do feel free to share those with your professional networks. Please do take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. And please do join us for another webinar in the future. Please see the website for further details. You can also watch any previous webinars that you may have missed. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars as well as recently published articles. And finally, you can download the WebEF app from the App Store or Google Play, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content around the built environment. So until the next webinar, goodbye and thanks for attending.